asked me to read this to you today, and thanking you all for joining us at this presentation. We had planned to do this conference to address the important topic of youth suicide prevention and helping meet the requirements of the new state law requiring educators to have 2 hours of professional development in youth suicide prevention. At that time, we didn't know we were in November, how different our world would be, the one that we're in today right now. So rather than cancel this important conference, we've shifted it to this online platform because we know how important the issues of mental health and suicide are, especially during times like these. Today's workshop is meant to meet the requirements of the new law, but it is also more importantly about compassion and not simply compliance. We need to support each other now more than ever, and please know that Megan will be available to help support you, as will NEA New Hampshire, you and your students in everything you do. And respectfully remind you also to take care of yourself and all the other important people in your lives right now. We will be recording this so that we can have it for folks who are late or who for some reason could not make it. We'll be sharing the screen shortly of the slides and going back and forth, and at any time if you want to ask a question, since there are so few of us, unmute yourself and ask, or in the chat room, type in the chat side here, type your question, and I'll make sure that Clayton gets that answered for you. I think we're going to start. Is that good for everyone? Let me share the screen with you. And Clayton, you can begin anytime you want. We are recording, so off we go.
Okay, so thank you for coming online on this Saturday morning to kind of discuss some of these components, and I'm guessing that each of you are been very busy and very frantic and first of all, trying to make a lot of changes and adjust so that your students and your communities are taken care of. And then in addition to doing this under conditions that, to be frank, you're kind of working in a completely different environment that's outside your comfort zone. The analogy I used the other day is it's kind of like I feel like every day I'm going into a presentation, but for whatever reason, my business suit is about 2 sizes too small. I can still do it, but it just feels uncomfortable, and I'm not really as smooth and as fast and as efficient as I'm used to. So kudos for everybody still for where you're at presently. So today we're going to be talking about suicide awareness for the managers. Another individual on another online chat room, Cynthia, she's working with the line staff and some of the instructors and a variety of individuals that would be considered gatekeepers. I'm going to be talking with more of the manager types that you may not be on the exact front line, but you will be impacted and be involved in some type of situation if a suicidal crisis does come up. So a little bit about my background. Like I said, my name is Clayton Davis. I'm a behavioral clinical account manager for Cigna. By trade, I am a licensed therapist, and so I am embedded with a number of our departments with Cigna to kind of address mental health issues, mental health behavioral benefits, and a whole potpourri of things to kind of help our clients partner in being able to address the mental health components. On a side note, just to connect with this organization, when I was asked to come to here, I thought it was great because when I was in graduate school working on my counseling degree, I actually was a substitute teacher for 2 years working within the school districts, and so I can kind of sympathize with some of the day-to-day dynamics that you're facing and dealing with on a regular basis. Once again, kudos to you for the wide range of challenges that you had to do. I simply just had to come into some classroom and read the teacher's lessons plan and then figure out what do we need to be doing today, regardless of whatever building I was going to or what school district. So let's get started. First off, is there any questions from anybody out there? It looks like there's 3 of y'all on the online right now. Is there anything in particular you want me to kind of set aside to make sure that I touch upon throughout the day? Because I do have a list of things in there, but I just want to make sure I'm hitting all the points. Any questions, thoughts?
Yes.
All right, so let's go ahead.
Help for families who have already experienced a suicidal event, specifically the siblings.
Siblings. Gotcha. So I'll put that in one of the areas that we'll touch upon later on. Any other questions or comments? All right, so if we want to go to slide 2 there. All right, so some of the things, just to kind of level set, these are some of the areas that we're going to talk about here. And with this size of group, feel free to jump in and just say, if you've got a question, butt in and say, hey, what about this? Or what is that? And I will either A, be able to kind of address what we can in this context, or I will try to see what I can do to direct you to resources to be able to answer that question. So today we're going to look at some of the suicide statistics, some of its impact on the environment. I also look at some of the common myths and misconceptions, and then also kind of paint the thing of look at what are some of the suicide risk factors and warning signs. And then also discuss some of the steps that you all can be able to take in if you are becoming aware of warning signs. One of the things is we're not necessarily going to do is fully diagnose mental health issues. We're also not going to be, I'm not going to advocate one suicide risk assessment over another. There are a wide range of suicide assessment tools that are out there. Those are designed for clinicians. So I'm assuming that some of you may be licensed clinicians, but in the context where it is, that's one of those things best left for somebody who's licensed. So that if you have licensed therapists in your building, that would be excellent resource to leverage. If not, there are some things to look at utilizing, either national hotlines or looking at local community health centers. So go ahead to the next slide. So why do we do this? There's a number of reasons. Number one is anytime people are put into some situations that's a little bit out of the comfort zone, it can be very uncomfortable. It could be very, very scary, very traumatic, and difficult. One of the things I always think back is back in my early days when I transitioned into a management role, that I was a therapist and I got promoted up to be managers over the other therapists and the clinical staff. I remember there were times that staff would come to my office and they'd be like, hey, Clayton, can I talk to you for a second? And I was like, sure. And then we're like, can I shut the door? I'm like, okay. And typically when they would shut the door, they would many times would unload a lot of different things that were going on in their personal life. And I always think back of, I come from a background as a therapist, and so that's kind of my wheelhouse of things that if somebody's becoming emotional, if there's a lot of difficult things, I could kind of navigate. But I know that with some individuals, if you're like an HR benefits manager or some of that don't come from that clinical background, I always kind of wonder, what do they do? And that's what makes it is. And so if we can kind of maybe get a few little tools in the back of your head, so to make those situations a little less stressful, and then also realize that you're not in it alone, that one of those things of you being the only individual to be tackling this is many times not the ideal situations. You want to be able to leverage on some of your resources. So, and it affects many individuals. The teachers will be overwhelmed. The other staff overwhelmed. You'll feel overwhelmed. Many times you'll have 100 different questions that'll be popping into your head, and you are put in kind of a difficult position. So it's one of those things to kind of wonder. Go to the next slide, please. So some of the statistics that we look at on this is suicide is on the rise. As of right now, these are some of the numbers that we look at. There's 117 per day, or about 1 every 12 minutes in the United States. It's the 10th leading cause of death over all ages. Highest rate of suicide is the 45 to 54 age group, although the adolescent age group that demographic is very close behind. Typically, it's the older population, the elderly, and the adolescents that we see a lot of the higher attempts. In terms of myths, there is almost 4 male suicide for every female, and that's completed. Because then on the flip side, there are gender differences that females will attempt 3 times more frequently than males. Anybody want to take a guess on, even though females attempt 3 times more frequently, males complete at a much higher rate? Anybody want to take a guess why?
Are they using firearms?
Yep. Males stereotypically, well, statistically, typically, will utilize more violent. So they will use firearms, they'll use automobiles, they will jump off, they will use very violent, very immediate, so that the window of opportunity to be able to assist that individual is very, very narrow, if none at all. Whereas females typically will use things like either cutting or overdose, to where there is an opportunity for somebody to intervene during the process and activate medical services to be able to assist them. So now that's typically, that's not, you know, if you're thinking, like I said, the term bell curve is thrown around a lot, you're looking at, this is what most of the time, there are females that will utilize a violent means, but, and once again, we look at the impulsiveness and some of the other components of it. Also, when we start breaking that down into New Hampshire numbers, the New Hampshire numbers are actually higher than the national average across the board. In fact, they are 50% higher than the national average right now for the state of New Hampshire. Some of the other components within the CDC nut research is it's the second leading cause of death for children ages 10 to 24, that age group. And then the other component is the trend is the suicide attempt rates have been going up. And in fact, the last 2018 numbers, that was the highest rate over the last 40 years as far as attempts. In terms of high school students, when you start looking at some of the demographics within the high school students, you have 17.2% of high school students will consider suicide. And then the other component is, of the students that do pass from suicide, 90% of them had a coexisting mental health issue. So there's some of the numbers when you start looking at that as things change. Go to the next slide. So this is one of those things where we look at is we're looking at the myths of just, and I'm gonna, if I was in the room, this is where I would have an exercise where we do thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs in the middle of the myths. So I'm just gonna like have you shout out with this small group of what are some of the myths and facts. The first one is, do you think people who talk about suicide won't really do it? Thoughts? Yay, nay?
Honestly, I don't know.
Okay. So that's actually not true. So most people who commit or attempt suicide have given some clue or warning. So there are warning signs that they will actually say. Another one is, this is what makes people don't want to talk about it, is they're afraid that mentioning suicide will give them the idea. What do you think? Is that something that's accurate or not accurate?
Not accurate?
I don't think that's accurate.
No, that is correct. Mentioning suicide, that's also not true. That you don't, because I know I've heard someone say, well, I'm afraid that if I start talking about it and asking them these questions, that I'll put that idea in the head. The thing is, that idea was already in the head, regardless of you putting it there or not. That's one of those, none of us have that kind of power to put ideas into people's head like that. So no, that's correct. Another one is, if they're determined to do it, nothing will stop them.
Hopefully a myth.
I think it's a myth.
Yeah, that's correct. So you can go ahead, George, if you want to hit the button that should bring up the answers. So that's also a myth, that yes, there is there is some things that someone is determined to do it. There are a lot of things that can help alleviate that. The other thing is, once someone gets the idea of suicide in there, are they at risk for the rest of their life for suicide? Answer's not. Suicidal thoughts is a time-limited crisis. You know, there's a wide reasons of how come people get to that place, but it is time-limited. You know, and that's one of the reasons that if you think about it, every state has some type of, say, involuntary commitment process. And it all boils down to either they're a threat to harm themselves or others. And almost every state, it's roughly a 72-hour hold. You know, and now it can be, you know, reevaluated, but it's time limited because, you know, there's a reason why they pick 72 hours, because typically within a observable environment where people are able to be prevented from harming themselves, minimize the opportunities for harming themselves, there's a lot of things that they can do in the hands of clinicians to kind of reassess where they're at and say, get some aftercare all lined up for them. So no, it's time limited. It is a reaction to a crisis, and there's a lot of warning signs that we can see. Any thoughts, questions about that part? Okay, so let's kind of dive into the risk factors. So let's go into the next slide, please. So some of the risk factors we've already kind of touched upon, where there is a high rate of depression or other mental health issues. Now, one of the caveats is just because somebody is depressed does not instantly mean that they're suicidal. But people that do attempt suicide quite frequently do have depression as a component of that. One of the other things is substance abuse. Many times there is substance abuse involved in the component. Either they are actively abusing substances, or in many cases, there is a higher rate of people who've completed suicide, where studies that have access to some of the autopsy is they have a higher rate of having substances in their system at the point of suicide than other individuals that passed away from non-suicidal causes. So quite frequently, one of the stories basically is people are very depressed, they begin to get suicidal, they begin to utilize substances, and unfortunately the substances such as alcohol has two components of it. It is a depressant. So if you're depressed and you begin to drink alcohol, you're going to become even more depressed. And then the other component of alcohol, as we all know, it also lowers inhibitions. So that's one of the other components that's a risk factor is, are they under the influence of a substance at that time? A couple other of the risk factor is family history of violence, abuse, if there is a family history of depression, if there's also a family history of suicide in there. Another component is if they've had a previous suicide attempts. And so these are some of the other things that we looked at that have increased some of the risk factors. The other one is being alone, cut off from others. You know, and this is one of the other components in this current climate that I really wish I had an answer for it right now, because, you know, with everybody basically being homebound, there's a lot more of being alone. I was reading about some of the materials that we have within Cigna that we've done research on the loneliness epidemic. And one of the terms I heard that I really thought was interesting is right now we're going into a social recession. So where socially we're just not able to interact with other individuals in a meaningful way that we're used to. And so there's some effects that emotionally that we're looking at. If you can go to the next slide. Some of the additional risk factors. If there's some type of loss that has occurred or something important, an event, some type of event causing shame, guilt, and humiliation. And that's one of the things as instructors that unfortunately, you know, and as people are going through adolescence, Many times they may experience some type of event that does create intense amounts of shame and guilt, and they may feel very humiliated. And then it's one of those things of, what can we do to identify those components? Another risk factor is physical health. Is some individuals that are going through some type of medical or chronic medical conditions where there is some health issues involved. And then the other one is exposure to someone else's suicidal behavior. Unfortunately, we've seen that periodically. There'll be communities where one individual will have suicide, and it'll almost create a suicide cluster within that community where multiple individuals will attempt suicide. Another danger for risk factor is easy access to lethal means. So do they have access to the lethal means? Once again, going back to the firearms, in some rural areas, and like I said, I'm from Missouri, where I'm very familiar with being in rural areas myself, people quite frequently hunt, so there is availability of firearms and various other lethal aspects. And then the other component is just, do they have a history of being very impulsive? Once again, for those who work with adolescents, that's, your run-of-the-mill adolescent will do a lot of impulsive things just on a day-to-day basis before they even get depressed or suicidal. So it can be very difficult. And one of the things to look at is individually, just having one of these risk factors is not necessarily a danger for suicidal thoughts. Like, once again, many of you are probably looking at this going, yeah, that probably describes 2/3 of my adolescence in my high school as far as what they're going through. So it's tricky. It is very tricky. So some of the things is to try to be able to pay attention to some of the subtle signs and cues. Any thoughts or questions at this particular juncture on the risk factors? So let's kind of dive into it a little bit more. So going into the next thing is, so when we're looking at mental health issues, and once again, there's a wide range of mental health issues, but the most common one when you start looking at the suicide is depression. It's very common. I also do what's called mental health first aid, which is a whole full day of training, and we look at some of the components. And we're looking at depression and anxiety, those types of issues. In the adult population, that's typically almost 20%. Close to 1 out of 5 people will struggle with some varying degree of depression and anxiety over the past year. So it's very common. But one of the other problems that fortunately we're getting better about is there is a stigma associated with mental health. That many times it's the old saying of, if somebody's depressed and down, people are like, well, just snap out of it. That's not something you just snap out of it. That there are a lot of, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole for depression, but it is an illness. There are chemical components to it. There are medical issues. There's also a wide range of things that could be going on medically that could be fueling the depression. So once again, like I said, we're getting better about not stigmatizing mental health. We're kind of in a good space right now as far as addressing those areas. More and more celebrities, more and more professional athletes. Like, for example, I can think of, Kevin Love, NBA basketball player for Cleveland. 2 years ago, he started coming about with his struggles with mental health issues and been very open and honest about, seek some help. Michael Phelps, the world-class swimmer, he's been very advocating, talk to somebody, start talking about it. He was able to say, hey, I'm a great, swimmer, but it hasn't really equipped me in being able to cope with mental health. So it's becoming more and more acceptable to seek mental health components. Now, the problem, though, with depression is if the depression is not treated, it can progress and become to suicidal thoughts. So that's one of the things to take a look at, is to be able to, realize some of the resources is to have a number of tools in your toolbox to be able to look at, what do they have available in there. And go to the next slide. So recognizing. So some of the signs of depression. So there's the hopelessness, there's feelings of guilt. It may present as pain. Sometimes people may have more active pain frequently. Concentration drops, performance, weight gain, weight loss or weight gain. Because one of the things is when people are struggling, and this is not just with the depression, if they're struggling with some type of emotional difficulty, we all react to it differently. For example, eating patterns will start to adjust. Either you'll start eating more or eating less. I was having a conversation with a couple colleagues the other day is, with all of us working at home, we kind of all come to the conclusion that some of us are eating healthier and working out more just to burn off the stress, and then other of us are stress eating. So it's kind of like a lot of people's weight is adjusting. Either we're gaining weight or we're actually losing weight in a healthy, productive manner. So it's kind of like we all react differently. So somebody who's going through some emotional issues, they are going to have you can see some weight gain or weight loss. The changes of sleeping behaviors, sleeping patterns will go up or down. There will be the case where they want to sleep all day, or they can't sleep at all. They're staying up until 3 a.m. every night and then getting up at 6 because they're just staring at the ceiling because a lot of different things in their head just is not shutting down. The other component to look at is withdrawing from contact, where if you can see that their patterns are starting to change. And we start looking at, say, within the school system, with the students and even your staff, you're with them a significant amount of time, and you're involved very close proximity with them emotionally, and you over time start to be able to pick up subtle changes in those things. And so pay attention to some of those subtle changes to be able to recognize some of those. One of the things I always kind of think of is listen to some of your gut. If something feels off, is to maybe look at it and try to at least be comfortable to address it. So you recognize some of the risk factors and some of the warning signs. If we can go to the next slide there. So some of the direct warning signs. This is real simple. Somebody says they're threatened to hurt them or kill themselves. That's the real easy one. These are some of the warning signs that they are. Another thing to look at is seeking access to the means. One of the things is if they are looking for some of the access to the means that they normally wouldn't be, that's one of the other warning signs. The analogy I always think of is, say if I had, one of my aunts, and I'm of the demographic that my aunts and uncles and parents, were from around in the 60s. And so if I have one of my aunts that's pretty much very peace-loving, very earthbound, very, very nonviolent, if suddenly she's seeking access and trying to get a firearm, this is a definite deviation of her mindset, of the way things that she goes about. So this is one of the warning signs to start looking at if you have these. The other component is talking or writing about these topics. If there's any silver lining in social media is these days more and more people will post and write on social media all kinds of things that they're thinking that they would never ever say in person. And so there are some components of, if you become aware of the social media aspects. So those are things, or you may hear about it because, I understand there are different variations of you're not going to have access to the student's social media in many times, but you may hear other people come forward. And then the other component is if there's an organized plan. Now that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, there are two particular risk factors that are the biggest ones, that are very significant. when you're looking at all these things? Because I've just kind of thrown a lot of different factors at you. Anybody guess what are the two biggest risk factors for suicide? Or you might have even heard them before. Anybody know what the two big ones are? The two biggest dangers for warning signs is previous attempt. If they've attempted this before and they're talking about, again, their risk factor is very, very much higher if there's a prior attempt. The other component is that there's an organized plan. Is there an organized plan? Now, just because they don't have an organized plan doesn't mean that you're completely scot-free, because, I mean, some individuals, they just don't do planning. But if there's an organized plan and there's a prior attempt, those are two really big red flags to be aware of. Any questions up to this point there? So be aware of some of those red flags of what they've got going on there. There are some additional warning signs too. If you go to page 11. So some of the noticeable changes, once again, going back to mood and behavior signs. So loss of interest and joy in life. If there's some things that you've noticed that normally would get them excited, that normally they just don't get up for, that's one of those things that something is up. You know, that when I'm doing the mental health first aid, when I'm talking about some of the dangers, one of the things to look at is, you know, if things that they really get excited for, they're not excited anymore, something's up. You know, I'm from Missouri. I attended University of Missouri. And so to this day, I love SEC sports. So if it's a Saturday, you know, one of the things I love doing is Mizzou football. And if Mizzou beat Alabama in football, theoretically it happened, but most likely it's not. But if they did happen, and if I'm just kind of like, or I don't even watch the game, there's something up, because these are things that normally I'm very excited and passionate about. And I get really, you know, it brings a lot of joy. So it's one of those things, if suddenly the things that normally gets the person up, they're no longer interested, there's something going on. And then there's usual, saying life is meaningless, other component. The other thing is sometimes it may not be fully suicidal, to where there may be an increase in rage and anxiety and outward anger. Because one of the components with depression and emotional issues is some people, they take their issues inward and they internalize them. Other individuals take those issues and external them. So they there's a lot of lashing out. And for those of you who work with adolescents, you know, I'm not telling you anything you haven't already learned or know already about. Some of them withdraw, some adolescents act out and emotionally. So there may be an increase in that. Sleep patterns, change of personalities. One of the other things is noticeable change in personality and mood is one of the danger signs that some people may not be aware of. Is sometimes what will happen is, if you were aware of somebody that was suicidal, if there was a very sudden change as far as being more upbeat and more outgoing, that doesn't necessarily mean that the danger is over. What that can actually mean in some cases is that they've made a decision, where if they're struggling with a big decision and they decided that they're going to follow through with their suicidal thought, that in some ways it brings them a little bit of joy, because these decisions can scare them. They're kind of terrified. They're kind of like having these feelings, and they're struggling with both sides of the fence, and they've made a decision so that they just haven't acted out on that yet. So if anybody who's ever been faced with making a very big decision, even though you didn't know if the decision was the best one, the fact that you kind of decided this is the course of action I'm going to do, you're a little more relaxed. You know, the subtle analogy I always think back of is anytime, like if you think back when you accepted the position you're in right now, that you were weighing the pros and cons of going into or going to a whole nother organization, that it was a very difficult decision at the time. Once you decided this is what you're going to do, you hadn't actually called in and said, yes, I'm going to do this and done all the other things to get there. But once you decide, okay, I'm going to do this, you still had all those doubts of, is this going to be the best move or am I making the biggest mistake of my life? But you felt a little more upbeat because you at least made a decision. Does that kind of make sense? Any thoughts on that?
Does change in parental status, for example, divorce or moving, make adolescents any more liable to these thoughts?
The short answer is yes. How much of a impact it has, that's going to vary. So once again, it's any time a thing to where if you go back to sudden changes, some of the components of traumatic things, shame and humiliation, because many times, like I said, people will internalize and feel shame because of some of that. Like let's take a divorce, for example. Some children will almost internalize a certain level of shame, even though the divorce really had nothing to do with them. They internalize it. Does that kind of make some sense?
Yes, it
They
does.
feel embarrassed about it. So, but once again, it has to do with the makeup of how they were before some of these events occurred. Like I said, some adolescents, they couldn't care one way or the other. Other times they're very emotionally invested. So it's just more of how do they perceive that? How do they internalize some of these dynamics around them? So hopefully that kind of helps out of looking at some of the warning signs, of being aware of some of these components. So, all right, if we can go to slide 12. There we go. So we've kind of talked about mood signals, direct warning signs, but some of the actions of what's going on in. So also the physical actions, because these are what we call the signs and symptoms. One of the things I always think about is to differentiate. We're looking at mental health components. There are signs of symptoms of distress. A symptom is what that individual is actually feeling. So you don't always know the symptoms, because some of the things we've talked about before, we can't see. Signs are the things that you can actually physically see, hear, so that you can actually, from an outsider, because I think one of the dangers is we always want to focus in when we do actually get to the point where we're having discussions, focusing on the signs, the things that you can physically see and hear. We don't necessarily want to dive into the symptoms because, we don't know the full story, if that makes sense. So let's look at some of the actions. What are the signs? So the first one, like I said, neglect of appearance or hygiene. We're looking at some of the dynamics there of how this is affecting them. And once again, this may be tricky because, their day-to-day is probably the same t-shirt, or it could be different. So you're looking at what is the differences. Is there a change in their neglect of appearance or hygiene? And notice I said smell. Sometimes the people just stop bathing. And so you can kind of smell the difference. Unexplained drop in work or school performance. If there is some type of drop, that you just really can't account for. Isolating. If somebody's normally very socially active, and suddenly they're isolating to themselves quite frequently, something's up. Another component is risk-taking behaviors. Some individuals will begin engaging in risky, impulsive, or very self-destructive things. And in fact, in some ways, it's almost like they're courting some kind of accident. That's the other thing is some of these people that they don't want to be actively suicidal, but they're really hoping that something traumatic happens to them. And so they'll put themselves in all kinds of risky types of situations, very fast driving, street racing, or taking up, rock climbing when they've never done these kind of things before. that's very, very dangerous. Another thing is, we've probably heard this one before, people start giving away their belongings. They start tying things up, saying goodbye, and they're kind of like some individuals, they're bundling things up to make sure that everything's taken care of when they leave. So it's one of those things to look at. These are some of the signs you can actively, if you have to have the conversations, you can actively point to. So any questions about the signs and some of the symptoms that we've kind of talked about that could be emerging? And keep in mind, it's tricky because, you know, you will be with people for extended periods of time, but at the end of the day, you're not with them 24/7. So it's one of the, I always think in terms that it's a fine line, because you want to pay attention to the very subtle signs, because you're not going to be able to see the full picture, kind of like the tip of the iceberg. You don't know what's underneath the surface. But being able to look at. So that'd be something to kind of think about here, of being able to ask those kind of questions. So any other questions related to the signs or symptoms there? All right, so kind of going into the next question. So how do we talk to people about this? Either, you know, you can substitute the word employee for student. So this is one of those things that it's very tricky, because I'm not going to lie, this is the best time to be able to try to pay attention to your own body cues, your own verbal cues, so that people do not respond in a negative manner. The first thing is, you want to be direct. This is one of those conversations that you don't necessarily want to dance around. That if you are concerned, it's, you know, you need to be able to be comfortable voicing your concerns. And then also, when you voice your concerns, be very direct in terms of identifying the sign that you've seen, identify your concerns, and then also at point blank asking, you know, are you considering harming yourself? Are you thinking suicidal thoughts? Because we want to be very clear on what our concerns are, why we're concerned, and being able to ask directly. And the other thing is, you want to maintain a confident tone of voice, but you also want to make sure that you're in that in-between spot. Because ultimately, you want to be approachable. You want the individual to be comfortable sharing, you know, yes or no. You know, the analogy I think of is like some individuals, you know, your mind is going 120 miles an hour. You may be a little panicky. You know, your tone of voice may be like, oh my God, are you thinking about committing suicide? In which case, some individuals are going to lie to you at that point, because they can tell you're very upset. They can tell you're very overly concerned. And some individuals, some of their suicidal thoughts is they care about your feelings and they don't want you to be overly alarmed. And so in that case, they're going to be, oh no, I'm fine. So in that case, they may basically lie to you. So you want to make sure that you're not, you know, panicking. Because there, like I said, some individuals are caretakers. You know, they, even though they're trying to commit suicide, they also are concerned about your feelings for a little bit at that time. Or the other aspect is dismissive. We don't want to be, oh my God, you're not thinking about hurting yourself again, are you? So you don't want to be dismissive. You want to be very calm. You want to be confident and very collected of being able to, you know, I'm worried about you. I'm concerned. I have to ask you this, you know, just because it bothers me, are you feeling suicidal? Are there things I can do to assist you? Any thoughts about just that? I want to pause for any about doing that exact question. Any concerns about even asking that question? So, a couple things, once again, to kind of look at the other, don't minimize, don't question their personal problems, because I think that's the other component is we also want to focus in on just this event. because I know that sometimes we want to fix all the problems. There's this term and that some of the therapists will use called the righting reflex. And what we call the righting reflex is some individuals, they want to help. They want to fix things. If they see something, if they see some turmoil, they want to fix them, which is, it's very good. In fact, I would be willing to wager that a lot of your staff, you know, they kind of have that righting reflex because they have to have a certain level of empathy. They want to assist people. They want to help people. So that's really good. But on the flip side, this is one of those things that our role in this exact situation is to not be therapists and to fix this crisis. Our role really is to be able to, as the gatekeeper, is to be able to identify what is going on, sense the risk factors, and to help navigate them to the appropriate level of resources. So your role is not to, quote, fix the problem. It's to basically to connect them individuals with appropriate professional help. And then keeping in mind, once again, going into protecting their privacy. So ideally, of course, you want to take them into some type of environment, pull them into an office or another room, as opposed to having these types of conversations out on the hallway or out in the middle of a classroom, which, you know, I'm assuming at this stage of the game, everybody on this call is kind of like they understand the need for that, of you want to respect the privacy, but you also want to be able to assist them to where it's kind of a balance of bringing others into this, but bringing in the appropriate individuals. So it could be scary. I understand that it is kind of be scary, but once again, just always kind of keep in mind what's your role in that. Because like I said, I know that some of us, we feel like we need to be the ones putting out the whole fire, and really that's not our role. One of the terms I use quite frequently is we all need to stay in our lane. You know, understand what you can and cannot do. You know, I'm a licensed therapist, but there's certain things that I stay in my lane, like, for example, medications. I'm not a medical doctor, so many times I will consult or connect people to psychiatrists. You know, I may get the sense that there's some stuff that maybe there's medication that could be assistance, but like I said, I connect them to somebody who's more appropriately. And I know that one of the dangers is that sometimes people will feel like they will start thinking like, well, you're just trying to shove me off to somebody else when you're trying to connect them to appropriate help. The analogy I a lot of times will say is, no, I really want you to get the best help. You know, I know that you may be comfortable sharing these with me right now at this time and place, but I always say is like, for example, I understand how to do electrical work. I have a basic fundamental understanding. I'm fairly handy at home to where I kind of have an idea on how I could rewire the house. I will never ever live in a house that I rewired because I would be scared it would burn down to the ground. And that's the kind of the thing that I've actually used that precise analogy with talking to somebody who's suicidal, trying to connect them to somebody. So that it's, I'm worried about you. I want you to get the best help, somebody who is so much better at these situations than I am. Does that kind of help you out a little bit? Any comments on that bit? Okay, so going to slide 14. So what if they are threatening self-harm? So number one, we want to act immediately. So we want to, we do not want to minimize this. We want to strike while this is happening. So act immediately. Another component is we do not want them to be alone. That's the other component. Since this is a time-limited crisis, people are more prone to act out on some of these thoughts when they're alone than when they're with somebody. So you want to have somebody physically with them until they have actually been connected with somebody else. Don't allow them to leave the building. And once again, as long as the safety of you and your employees are not a concern. You know, that your hands may be tied and of what you can and cannot do, but you know, do what you can to keep them contained in that environment until you can connect them to the appropriate level of treatment. And once again, 911 if there's appears to be imminent danger. And once again, utilize your resources around you, HR, security, risk management. If you've got therapists in there, if you have licensed counselors within the building, you want to utilize them if possible, developing some of these components. So these are some of the things to do. One of the analogies, and this is just philosophically, I know many people get very kind of, well, when do I call 911? And that's a very, very hard answer. I'm not going to give you X, Y, and Z. If you have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom, then this is when you call 911. Simply because anytime you start working off a checklist, a very precise checklist in terms of some of these types of crises, there's always going to be some type of oddball situation that comes through that doesn't really fit these neat boxes. So it's one of those use your best judgment. The other component is the think in terms that get asked in these types of conversations is, what if they don't want help? These are some of these situations. Here's my guide of how I make decisions is think of this crisis as if it was a medical crisis. If somebody was exhibiting medical symptoms, at what point do you call 911 whether they want you to or not? I think back of if somebody is looking like they're having a heart attack, is there some situations that I'm going to call regardless because they may say, we all have relatives that are like, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, I'll shake it off, when they're not fine. And then there's other times is, do we necessarily want to call 911 because they have a paper cut? There's a fine line of where do we initiate some of these things. And so like I said, I always go back to, what if this was some type of medical situation? How would be my guiding principle? Does that kind of help you out when you start thinking in terms of treating mental health exactly like a medical crisis? So now one of the other things to look at is, and this is where I'm kind of just wondering is, because we've got a couple people on the line, is does your building have some type of policies and procedures and workflows related to mental health crises? Do you have some mechanisms in place? Does anybody have anything that maybe they can share so we can maybe steal from each other at this point?
Yes, our school resource officer is often the one we put students in contact with, and specifically if a student is also threatening to harm others in the building, that's often a cry for help as well.
Yep. One of the things that I included that was embedded is, and this is one of the silver linings of us doing this virtual versus doing it in person, is I included the SAMHSA guide. There's a SAMHSA guide in there in the link that has a lot of materials on that you can kind of use to assist in developing some policies and procedures when you're looking at suicide. And it's a pretty bulky material. And, having worked in the non-for-profit sector many times, I'm very familiar with a number of finding public domain materials that's useful. And SAMHSA is from the federal government, so it's very well researched. So it's some ideas to kind of look into developing. So once again, it's good to have some resources and to have a certain game plan for these situations. Being from the Midwest, I don't know if we have any Midwesterners here, but I grew up having tornado drills from the time I could literally walk. And so I know what to do, that if a tornado or a major thunderstorm's coming through, to where I remember one time when I had somebody in college that was from New York that was, at our house, and a tornado warning, a siren went off, and they were like, what was that? It's like, well, that's a tornado warning, that there's a high probability of a tornado touching down someplace. And they completely freaked, where the rest of us, we didn't panic because we knew the drill. And that's the thing, is maybe come up with some things. And this is one of the reasons I'm assuming that the state of New Hampshire is instituting some of these things, is to practice these tools, to understand these and kind of go through them in your head, so that when these situations occur, you yourself are mentally have an idea, okay, this is what I do. I do this, Y, and Z, and this is some of the danger zones. So that hopefully you're a little more relaxed and have a few steps that you just do automatically without having to panic. Because once again, panic doesn't help anyone. But yeah, definitely have some type of game plan of what are your resources. And once again, familiarize yourself with the resources. Like I said, some areas you're going to be limited. I'm not going to lie. Like I said, you get to upstate New Hampshire, you're in the rural areas, it's going to be a little bit more tricky. And that's one of the reasons why one of the other ones is a simple one-pager. That is a list of national resources. These are self-help lines. For example, the suicide crisis hotline, because that's actually invaluable. I've actually had people utilize the suicide hotline in other clinical environments, simply because, number one, this is what they do. You know, I'm a therapist, but I don't deal with suicide on a day-to-day basis. You know, back when I was practicing, I was out in the field for, 17 years doing therapy. You know, it would come up, a few times a year. I would have to sit down with somebody that was suicidal, but it was not something I did on a day-to-day basis. And so I pulled in some of the individuals that they're experts on, because that's the other trick is, if you don't know, is this something we need to get immediate 911 help into a psychiatric unit, or is this something where they're just having some thoughts? It's not really for us to really assess. So getting some of these resources for them to sit down and assess further and to get a better feel for how severe is this crisis, because we want to connect them with the appropriate level of help. Once again, because like I said, some individuals, it's a passing thing where appropriately the level of risk is not super high to where they're able to, maybe they need to talk about it with a therapist and connect them in some partial hospitalization. Other individuals, it's very immediate. But at the end of the day, you're not licensed. You really are just trying to use the best you can with the tools available. Is that kind of helpful? So some of the steps, you can go to the next slide, is consultation. So some of the things to look at. Once again, you've got the materials on your thing with the SAMHSA guide to look at that. Also consulting with peers, talk to each other, see what they're at, bring in a number of individuals. Because some of the things you look at is, ideally you want to do a couple things. One, you want to have a mechanism in place. Two, you also want to see what are some of the protective factors that you can do. What are things that you can create within your environment to help the employees and the staff? There are some things that have been found to be protective factors that help people out, and either A, not having these types of crises, or B, feeling comfortable have resources. Some of the protective factors that research has found is students involved with sports. Do you have sports activities available for them to interact with? Also religious affiliations. If people are connected with certain churches, I know that that's kind of some people, it may be a hot topic for some individuals, but people that have some type of faith-based organization they're connected to, I've been able to connect to resources to be able to help alleviate these. Fine arts programs, people that are engaged in various types of fine arts, band, theater, art classes. There's a community that they feel they fit in, but also there's things that they can kind of connect to. Parental connectiveness, of how engaged are the parents involved in the children and just all the parents involved in the school system. And then the other component is creating an atmosphere of positive acceptance within the school environment for all kinds of diverse groups of individuals. And that's what makes it very challenging. I'm not going to lie, that's easier said than done, but how can you make an environment so that all these different diverse groups within the organization is able to feel comfortable? Is there somebody they can go to? Do they feel comfortable connecting with other individuals? The other thing is to looking at not just resources with them, but your own resources. So looking at what are some of the components that you have as far as expert consultation. So looking at, keeping a list of your benefits of what you have in there. Some of you all have Cigna insurance and you have access to the EAP. I know School Care and a number of the organizations have our EAP program. So, and this is not just ours, many other EAP products have the same thing, is we have expert consultation to where there is management. So within most EAP programs, and Cigna's included, is there's some type of component for managers to be able to call in, and then there's a prompt identifying yourself as a manager to be able to bring in and to look at what are some of the expert consultations of to be able to do, okay, I have this types of situation. What are my resources to be able to do, to be able to utilize this? And then additionally, and like I said, you have resources in there is, are you able to bring in outside experts into it? For example, within the EAP program, and once again, this is not just, not just with Cigna, but other EAP programs will have what's called critical incident response process. What this is typically is you have some type of critical incident, such as, unfortunately not, but periodically it may be a suicide or a sudden death within the organization, is to be able to tap into the resource to be able to bring in a licensed clinical resource provider that's contracted to be able to come in and kind of debrief these types of situations. So if you have some type of traumatic situation, either a death or an accident, it may not even be suicide, but it may be something that may generate, like, I wish I could say this happened just once, but one situation that's happened multiple times. Keep in mind, I function on a national level, is that either an employee or a teacher will unfortunately have an accident, and a fatal accident with there's a sudden death in the organization. And it will be somebody that is very impactful. Everybody loved them. They were a leader in the organization. And it creates a lot of uncomfortable feelings. It's being able to, the benefits of bringing somebody in to kind of address some of these critical situations at the pass. So keep in mind, if there's one thing that I always hope for people to do, and they actually get done with a seminar when I talk about suicide, is that generates, I want to churn the waters so that you're thinking in terms of, what can I do when I go back to my organization to come up with what are my resources? What is my game plan? And then how can I come up with a very precise thing and then disseminate that toward my staff? Go to the next slide. And last but not least, take care of yourself. Because that's the other burden of, like I said, I'm assuming everybody in here is in some leadership type of position, is sometimes that can be kind of a lonely situation of figuring out to make sure that you turn around and take care of, whether it's through peer support groups, whether it's utilizing the EAP or your therapist for yourself, but do not underestimate the impact on some of these components. There's this thing within the health field called secondary PTSD. And what this is individuals that help people with PTSD on a regular basis, over time, it starts to kind of wear you down emotionally yourself. If you're dealing with a lot of these things that are very difficult, you have to be a certain level of empathy to be able to help people. But the danger is you're absorbing a lot of these things that cumulative over time, multiple case after case after case, it can start to wear you down and affect you in ways that you may not realize. So utilize some of your own support systems. For example, back in St. Louis, I was aware of, kind of a consortium of therapists that they would meet together on a regular basis, not for case consultation. They were not really going to violate HIPAA or anything, but it was more of just a resource so that some of the individuals can kind of work together to emotionally support each other because of the dynamics of just stressors that most people don't realize that they go through. So once again, so these are some of the things to kind of look at is what's your game plan? What are your resources? You know, looking at some of the community centers. You know, one of the things to look at is there are a number of non-for-profits in your area. Find those numbers and find out, are they still open? You know, this may be something you may want to actually bring in your counselors is, are they aware of some of these support groups? Is also looking at what are some of the helps for the family is, because once again, they may or may not have health insurance themselves, so they may not have access to it. So looking at what are the community centers. Some of the other things is, and for the cases where people do actually complete suicide, there are quite frequently many of the funeral homes, actually this is what they deal with regularly, will either A, have a resource for grief support groups, for people to process what they actually experience, whether it's just unfortunately a non-suicidal death or if a suicidal death, but having a mental health professional available. That many people don't realize that many of the funeral homes either have it themselves. I remember back in St. Louis, a headhunter reached out to me from a local funeral home chain as they were looking to hire a therapist to come in to work directly for that funeral home chain to provide that services. It was just something they did for their customers that were kind of grieving, to be able to have that resource for them. So, any questions? Bulk of the materials. At this stage, I wanted to really throw it out to have kind of a more of a discussion. So first off, any comments or thoughts about what we covered right here? And please take yourself off mute because I know I do that too. So was this helpful? Was there certain areas that you think that we did not cover that you wanted to maybe dive a little bit further in? We do have the space. Because once again, that's the other thing about virtual is sometimes it's smaller room and the things are covered a little bit faster.
Yes, we do have a problem with students who are threatening violence to the school, and also the issues that when this happens in other locations, near and far, our students' reactions to this.
So do you have a mechanism in place so far, or are you kind of in the process of trying to figure out what can we do?
We are in the process. We did have a threat to our school, and it caused all of us to realize how important it is to establish safety.
Yep. Yeah, because it kind of puts you in a, it kind of attacks you on two fronts. Because number one, obviously you have to come up with a plan for physical safety, you know, and that's one of those things that physical safety is kind of, I'm not a police, so I couldn't tell you about getting the physical safety protocols in place. But obviously I'm a big fan of consult. In this case, probably bringing in two types of consultant. One is figuring out what can you do for the physical safety of your building. You know, going in, you know, do you want to have, you know, metal detectors? Do you want to have, you know, doors that locked? Of looking at some of the components. And then also, unfortunately, looking at the real world of, you know, how are we going to finance some of those protective measures? So that's would be one area to consult in the physical safety. The other aspect is looking at what can you do, going back to the protective factors that I mentioned earlier, is coming up with number one, a game plan for the emotional health of individuals before, during, and after a crisis. Before is looking at those protective factors. You know, I mentioned before, do you have as inclusive as you can possibly be to make everybody feel like there's a place they can fit and that they're in a place where they're emotionally accepted. You know, that's one of those things, and that's where you bring in all your resources, the teachers, the mental health therapist. Developing a game plan of how do you keep somebody physically safe during the crisis. So during that, so looking at what are your protocols, who are some of the people you can pull into a crisis, you know, who are your key staff, you know, do you have a therapist in the building, or if you don't, how can you get a therapist? So maybe going through when you get a chance of putting some of these, if you don't have it already, coming up with a game plan before, have redundancy plans. And then after is, what is your game plan to debrief after a situation has occurred? You know, do you offer therapists to the individuals impacted? Do you bring somebody in to debrief on some of these components? Like I said, I mentioned before, critical incident response. You know, that's, you know, we didn't invent that. That's something that's been around for a while of, you know, bringing in and offering some of these things for people. So, and I would also recommend doing it in a two-pronged way for the debrief is, number one, bringing somebody in to maybe talk to the room of all the individuals. First of all, educate people, because that's the other thing is people don't understand what they're going through. You know, and I'm not talking just about the adolescents. You know, adults have something traumatic happen to. We as adults still don't know how to process some of these things. So bringing in a professional to debrief on what just happened after the crisis has been stabilized, to kind of, quote, normalize what's happening and educate. Some people, it is a certain level that they just, you know, once we get education, they're fine and dandy. Other individuals, it will help normalize their feelings they have, and then what you do is you sweep in and you provide other resources that they can utilize confidentially. You know, like not everybody wants to share they're going to a therapist, but at least make sure that they have, these are the therapy options you have for them.
Good.
Does that give you some ideas?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep, good. Well, and I know that many times, for example, unfortunately, in this time and day where we have mass shootings in some environments, and unfortunately in some of the school systems, you know, many times they'll almost organize a batch of therapists to be able to swoop in to kind of have that after the crisis has been stabilized. So they have a big pool of therapists so that, you know, because I know, you know, many buildings, they may only have like 2 or 3 licensed therapists in a building where you've got 600 students. And they cannot cope with that large onslaught of people with that need to do a little bit of therapy. So sometimes they'll bring in a lot of therapists from the outside that are volunteers, and they do that kind of components. So like I said, I kind of keep it real simple. Resources before, during, and after.
Good. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad that was helpful. Any other questions or thoughts? Was the bottom line, did this really help stir the noodle up a little bit on getting you to think about some of the tools and resources? Because I'd be willing to bet you probably have some tools already in place. It's just a case of beefing it up.
Yeah, I have a question.
Or stealing from. Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, so when we have a crisis at our school, we do have the fact of pulling in other resources from out, but a lot of kickback I get from my staff is that they're not very open to that idea because the kids don't know them, so they're not going to open up to those resources, and so they're trying to keep things in-house. But at the same time, I'm in a small school, so it does make it a little bit easier for us to reach the kids in a timely manner. But is it more beneficial to have the resources there that maybe aren't known to the kids just as a resource, or is it more beneficial to have the resources that the kids actually know and may open up to about what's going on? I guess I'm just kind of wondering where to go with the staff, because every time we have something, it's, well, we'll handle it in-house. And I feel like we need to be reaching out more, even if the kids aren't, don't have those relationships with those resources.
Yep. In a perfect world, you have those resources in-house, but once again, like I said, coming from the non-for-profits, I didn't always get to work in a perfect world.
Mm-hmm.
So you understand it. So if you have a licensed therapist, so it's kind of like one of those things that I've seen organizations do is they kind of, it's almost like you build some of the resources in-house. So like if you have a therapist that's licensed, to have them trained to do some of these components, that would be a great tool to have in your toolbox for an immediate crisis, to have them right there. Because you're right, people do feel comfortable. They have a certain level of comfort of things that they understand and they know and they see on a day-to-day basis. And so you want to be able to utilize them whenever you can. But the two variables, once again, going back to the analogy of that may be not something they deal with on a daily basis. So I would almost recommend, if you can leverage them that they are comfortable with, to make them comfortable and to transition, to kind of hand them off to the expert.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, going back to where I feel like I said, I'm not going to live in a house that I did the electrical wiring on.
Right.
Because I know and you probably have staff that are very qualified and very good with children, but this might not be in their area they know 100% about. They know just enough about, navigating suicidal crisis they can do some of it, but at a certain point they're better served with a different level of expertise. So when you can't do that, once again, bring them in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm a fan of bridging. Because, like, for example, I can think of multiple situations. I'm kind of surprised it didn't come up. Is many times if you're dealing with a suicidal crisis, people will be like, well, should I do this alone? Should I have somebody else in there? I'm a fan of having somebody else in the room. Not because I'm worried about, like, a, quote, liability situation, but having somebody else twofold. One is to have somebody to kind of assist with all those little bitty things that you don't think of. Like say they've been crying for 30 minutes straight and you don't have any Kleenex in the room. So you don't want to leave them alone, but have someone just leave the room to get some Kleenex. But also sometimes, and I've done this before, where when I was the clinical supervisor, I didn't have the direct relationship with the patient that the tech had or the counselor had. So even though I would be tackling it, having somebody in the room that they were very comfortable with kind of helped out immensely. Does that kind of give you some ideas there? Is maybe use them as a gap to bring in the outsider.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm the same way. If I just if God forbid I have some significant medical issue, I'm just suddenly thrown in talking to some strange doctor I've never known. I don't know anything about. It goes a little bit better if my primary care physician I talk to regularly, they kind of bridge the gap and say, hey, this is,
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, good. Any other questions or comments?
I have a question about a specific situation that I've got going on right now. I have a student in our upper levels of our middle school who the weekend before school shut down, his father suffocated one of his 1-month-old twin brothers. And since we've shut down, I can't get him to really respond. Every once in a while we hear from him. I've tried to set up video chat, but I'm very concerned. He's got some other trauma in his past already. How do I can't go to his house. I can't force him to talk to me. What do I do? What are my responsibilities from here?
Well, number one is you look at, is there a threat of harm in the immediate? I mean, there's always the local enforcement agencies. They do have safety checks, so there is available that they do that. Although, like I said, the trick is, where are they at? Are they being overwhelmed with the current crisis? But number one is, if there is a safety check, I'm always a fan of, I'd rather feel embarrassed because I did a safety check when I didn't need to versus not doing it when I needed to. The other component is the kind of file in the back of your mind is, and the analogy I can think of is, sometimes you're setting up the next round of therapy. So the best thing you can do is come from a place of support, of signs and symptoms of what you can, but at a certain point, people are going to essentially push back. And so it's almost like sometimes people push back. They need to kind of digest all these materials. And so what they need to do is sometimes back in grad school, one of the things that the professor told me when I was kind of struggling with you know, I was trying to work with somebody. In some ways they were pushed, they were rejecting, and I had a lot of concerns, much not as severe as the concerns you have right now, but my concerns. And what he told me is sometimes what you're doing is you're actually setting up the next round of therapy, you know, so that when they get to that place where they're willing to accept the help, that your interaction was positive enough so that they don't feel like you're going to be, I told you so, or overbearing, so that they will be willing to approach you when they get into that other space. Does that kind of help you out a little bit as far as philosophically speaking?
Yes, I guess I just know his trauma past, so he's a big concern to me.
No, and it's definitely where from the outside, you can see there's a lot of, you can see trauma that definitely needs some professional assistance. The problem is they're not in a space to be able to accept the professional assistance, either through the adolescent, and then
Is it just me, or did we lose Clayton's audio?
I lost too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I lost it. Yes.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can text him.
I could hear everybody.
Oh, there you go. Okay. We lost you.
Okay, I'll go good back. So, yeah, I don't know what happened. I did not move or touch anything. Stuff happens. Now, where did I drop off? What was the last thing you heard from me?
Talking about when he's in a place to access counseling.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if you heard, but I was also saying is utilizing collaborative components with the parents when you are able to, because like I said, based on the small bit you told me, that sounds like a very complicated situation with parental, on who is the parent.
PCYF involvement before this, and they don't have a very good trust of the school.
Yep. So there's a lot of dynamics in definitely trying to get what are the parental environments, what the guardians involved to kind of get a collaborative thing. Because like I said, from the outside looking in, just from the limit thing is I'm definitely sensing that there's probably would benefit for some counseling services. Whether or not to get him or her to engage is a whole nother trick. I would definitely, like I said, collaborative with whoever's the parent or guardian. And the other one is trying to bring in some individuals that maybe have some type of experience, particularly with trauma, because I would say this definitely qualifies with trauma, where different people are at different stages, where definitely is going to need a very skilled therapist in this types of situation.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, comments? If there's no other questions or comments, I'm going to turn it over to the survey and all the other components. George, you still there?
Yes, I am. If I know some of you have, hopefully all of you have been able to see the chat portion there. So there's a couple of resources listed there, and then the link to the evaluation. The evaluation should be set up so it takes you to your certificate that you can use for the professional development hours. If that does not work, email Irv, because we know we can get you those certificates electronically if you need them. I think that's it as far as I have, as far as the NEA is concerned, and covering all the bases.
And once again, thank you for, like I said, attending this virtually and then kind of adapting on the fly. And I know that these are challenging times, and once again, and I anticipate that they're going to continue to be challenging for a little bit. But like I said, once again, as a fundamental thing, not just for suicide, consult and utilize your resources and reach out to other individuals. because number one, just the fact that you're not having to go through something alone makes it a little easier. And number two, many times you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that somebody may have already stumbled upon a solution for you. So thanks for attending. And once again, my name is Clayton Davis. I'm with Cigna, and I do a lot of a whole lot of different things related to behavioral as far as some of our mental health benefits. So we may speak again somewhere down the road. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.